My lords, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Malcolm Grant, the President and Provost of UCL, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight to this overcrowded and packed lecture theatre for Lisa Jardine's inaugural lecture. An inaugural lecture is one of those great features of a university calendar, is one of those punctuation marks. And Lisa's lecture is one of a series organised jointly between our two faculties of Arts and Humanities and Social and Historical Sciences. An inaugural lecture is not, of course, the first lecture that a lecturer gives. Otherwise, we will be somewhat late in Lisa's career. Sometimes inaugural lectures are given quite a long time after the incumbent has arrived at the institution. I recall one celebrated case in Cambridge where a professor gave his inaugural lecture some years after he'd retired. A number of people found that quite an agreeable approach, although many said that his ideas had not matured as well as he had. But the object of an inaugural lecture is to allow our new professor to do what they do, which is to profess what it is that they stand for and what it is that they hope to advance in the cause of knowledge at the institution in which they find themselves. Inaugural means a ceremony, if you like, of inauguration. It's a way of installing the new professor. So that's my formal duty tonight. At the end of the lecture, without saying anything, I shall deem Lisa to be inaugurated. And of course, on many occasions, professors give more than one inaugural lecture because they move between institutions, as is the case with Lisa Jardine. It's possible to be re-inaugurated. No, if you wish a precedent, it will occur on Monday on Capitol Hill, when the 44th President of the United States will be re-inaugurated in office. We've been studying very closely the order for service for President Obama to see what we could glean from it for our event tonight. And I think the thing that most attracted my attention was that immediately after the oath is taken, the United States Marine Band will perform 4 ruffles and flourishes, followed by Hail Columbia. We haven't quite the equivalent of that this evening, because this, as you know, is a sober and well-adjusted institution, in which, and this is a truth universally acknowledged, an institution in which every lecture is given with such brilliance that can be matched only by the eloquence with which it is delivered. The only people who would be surprised by that proposition are our students. But tonight, I know that Lisa's offering will truly live up to it, and will live up not only to that, but also to these comments which I derive from the prospectus, which was written in 1826 by our founding fathers. They said, and I quote, "Finally, the Council trust that they are about to lay the foundation of an institution well adapted to communicate liberal instruction to successive generations of those who are now excluded from it. An institution of such magnitude as to combine the illustration and ornament which every part of knowledge derives from the neighbourhood of every other part of knowledge, and with the advantages that accrues to all from the outward aids and instruments of libraries, museums, and apparatus. And then finally, where the inseparable connection of ample income and splendid reputation with the general belief of meritorious service may prove at once a permanent security for the ability of the teachers, as an incentive to their constant activity, and as a preservative of the establishment from decay." That is the manifesto of UCL from 1826. And that is what Lisa is about to live up to this evening. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Evelyn Welsh, who will provide us with some introductory words about Lisa Jardine, and also to introduce Professor Jacqueline Rose of Queen Mary, who, at the conclusion of the address, will deliver us a vote of thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Evelyn Welsh.
President and Provost and distinguished guests. It's an enormous privilege to be asked to introduce Professor Lisa Jardine's inaugural lecture at UCL, although actually from the number of people from Queen Mary here in the audience, we could get confused, but I promise not to during this introduction. Many of us in this auditorium will feel that Lisa needs no introduction, either because we've started our Sundays to her voice on Radio 4's point of view, or because her work has influenced the way that we think about the relationship between art, culture and science, about global commodities, about the relationship between England and Holland, or simply because her dynamism, energy and enthusiasm has touched us in some way. I first met Lisa just over 25 years ago when I was relatively new to the UK. And although it was another 15 years or so before we would work together at Queen Mary, an institution she was very influential in persuading me to come to, she kept an eye out for me in small but regular and crucial ways. And I now realize it wasn't just for me there. She did this for hundreds, indeed probably thousands of people. And this generosity and support for the wider community of Renaissance and early modern scholars very much characterized Lisa's work, and indeed lies at the heart of what she's done as a scholar. And it's telling that not only are we celebrating, I mean really celebrating her start here at UCL, but also that the topic of her lecture strongly relates to the work that she's been doing with her impressive team of researchers and PhD students from the Centre for Editing Lives and Letters, which has now achieved its 10-year anniversary. And it's not simply that Lisa has created her own career, she's also created a team of people capable of doing interdisciplinary work in a very unique way in the UK. And now for a list of achievements and honours. This is the factual bit of the introduction. Lisa Jardine, CBE, who studied in Cambridge, is now Professor of Renaissance Studies at University College London and Director of UCL Centre for Interdisciplinary Research in the Humanities and the Centre for Editing Lives and Letters, a post she took up after 20 years or more at Queen Mary University of London. She's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, an Honorary Fellow of King's College Cambridge and Jesus College Cambridge, Honorary Doctors of Letters from the University of St Andrews, Sheffield Hallam, and the Open University, and an Honorary Doctorate of Science from the University of Aberdeen. She was a trustee of the V&A Museum for 8 years, where she had a transformative impact on the design of the medieval and Renaissance galleries and was highly influential in selecting its current director there. She is patron of the Archives and Records Association and the Orange Prize, and in 2013 to 14 she'll serve as president of the British Science Association, which in 2012 made her an honorary fellow. And you can see from that long list of honours and affiliations that it's really a very unique position between arts and science, between science and culture, between politics and things which might be letters, things which might be objects, which makes Lisa's research so impressive. And she's published over 50 scholarly articles. Importantly, she's also thought that scholarship belongs not only in recherche editions, but in general best-selling books such as Worldly Goods, A New History of the Renaissance, Ingenious Pursuits, Building the Scientific Revolution, and How England Plundered Holland's Glory, which won the prestigious Cuntill International Prize in History. And a testimony to Lisa's ability to work with complex questions and across some of the most fundamental issues in culture and science comes from the fact that since 2008, she served as the chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the UK government regulator for assisted reproduction. And in December 2011, she was appointed a director of the National Archives there. So Lisa was having impact long before it was a twinkle in the government's eyes there. She did it because she passionately believed in it, not because she had to fill in a form. about it. And this long list of honours is testimony to why we sometimes call Professor Jardine a force of nature, to her energy and intelligence, and I am delighted to invite her to deliver her inaugural lecture, Temptations in the Archives, which will not only be a distinct and unique moment for all of us here in this room, but will be available for posterity through, I hope, the UCL digital archive and through the CEL website. May I invite Professor Jardine to deliver her inaugural lecture.
The trouble about being recorded for posterity is, what do you wear? I'd like to start very quickly with two sets of thanks. The first, and so heartfelt that I hardly know where to begin, is to the Provost Malcolm Grant of UCL, and to Henry Woodhausen and to Cathy Brown, and the three of them between them saw me into UCL so seamlessly, so effortlessly, so beautifully, that I think that when John Mullen found me on his books as head of the Department of English, he barely had time to blink. But the second group to whom I owe an equal heartfelt vote of thanks, or thanks, the second group to whom I owe great thanks is my Centre for Editing Lives and Letters team. I cannot tell you how much I owe them. So I do want to say a thank you at the beginning of this lecture to Dr. Matt Simons and Dr. Robin Adams. There, I got both your names right. I always get their names wrong on every public occasion, got them right this time, who trusted me, gave up their jobs and came with me without a murmur, without blenching. I think it was incredibly brave of them, and they've supported me astonishingly, right to the fact my water was poured. That was Matt, right? And Robin's sorting something else out. And then secondly, to my graduate students, who, except for the gentleman with the beard there, I think, are all sitting round the top there and round the top on the other side, who were your ushers seeing you to your seats. They too, somehow without blenching, moved from QM to UCL. They are the most extraordinary group of graduate students that any professor has had the privilege of working with. My only sorrow is that they're all graduating so fast that I'll have to get another lot, but they won't be as good. So thank you all. Thank you to those who've welcomed me, and thank you to those who have so absolutely eased my way here. This is the story of a paper chase, a seemingly fruitless search in the archives, which eventually yielded a 17th century letter I'd been trying to find for several years. It's a cautionary tale about the trust we historians place in documents and records, and how badly we want each precious piece of evidence to add to the historical picture. And it's a story which illustrates in a number of ways the essential uncertainty which underlies and ultimately gives purpose to archival research in the humanities. Uncertainty in spite of that reassuring materiality of the hundreds of years old piece of paper we hold in our hand. In 2009, at the end of a period working on 17th century Holland for my book Going Dutch, I took up a fellowship at the Royal Library in The Hague, working on their large holding of the correspondence of Sir Constantin Huygens. While researching his early career, I came across a sequence of almost illegible letters in French, exchanged in the 1620s between Huygens and someone he addressed with some familiarity as Mademoiselle Croft, or occasionally just Croft. The letters piqued my curiosity, not least because the assiduous editor of Huygens' substantial surviving correspondence, J.A. Worp, had chosen not to transcribe them in full in his complete edition. In fact, several of them he didn't transcribe at all. As for Croft, nobody of that name had figured anywhere in any of the Huygens materials I had read until then. Oh, I could have had that up. There you are. This is Sir Constantin Huygens, and his clerk is what it's called, although I believe, on the basis of some research that Dr. Robin Adams did, that it's his brother. And this hangs in the National Gallery, so it's familiar, actually, to the British. I'm sure it ought to hang in the Moritz House, but there you are, it hangs in Britain. Born in 1596, Constantin Huygens was a Dutch polymath diplomat, poet and musician who was personal secretary to the stadtholder Frederick Hendrick, is acknowledged to have played a prominent part in the artistic and cultural flowering at the court of the Northern Netherlands of Frederick Hendrick and his wife Amalia van Solms in the decades following the death of his half-brother, the previous stadtholder Maurice of Nassau, in 1625. Everything I'm talking about is roughly around 1625. There are too many dates always in academic lectures, but if you can hold on to that, you're talking a little bit before, just before, well, you're going to hear in a moment, just before Charles I comes to the throne in England, and before the English Revolution, but as it were, in anticipation of what's going to happen in England when all of those English royalists will actually move to Holland. So it's part of my remit around exchange between England and Holland. So we're around 1625. Although Sir Constantine is little appreciated here in Britain, he has a formidable reputation in the Netherlands, where, of course, he's called Huygens, but for anybody Dutch in the audience, I'm going to call him Huygens all the way through. Or Mr. Huggins, as he was always known in Britain. He has a formidable reputation in the Netherlands, where he's regarded as having almost single-handedly been responsible for raising the international profile of the court of Frederick Hendrick and Amalia in The Hague, transforming it into one of the most celebrated in Europe for its cultivation, artistic splendor, and general ostentation and glamour. And this year, 2013, in The Hague, in the Netherlands, there will be no fewer than 3 major exhibitions devoted to Huygens and his family, rich and wonderful exhibitions, which so if you want to fix a holiday to Holland and have a really wonderful cultural experience, I would recommend it. To give you some sense of that, this is a family portrait of Frederick Hendrick on the left, and Amalia and 3 of their children. It's 1647. It's actually a posthumous portrait because Frederick Hendrick died in 1647. This is when Amalia and Frederick Hendrick have achieved the rise from a sort of petit bourgeois court of the stadtholder to full, essentially, royalty. And this is one of the paintings in the Huis ten Bosch, the memorial that Amalia created just outside The Hague, with Frederick Hendrick seated in glory in the middle. And every time that one of my Dutch friends explains to me that they never had a royal family and they've never had an aristocracy, I produce a few of these pictures. This is another picture. That's the painting in situ. It's a whole room devoted to the memory of Frederick Hendrick. As many of this audience will well know, electronic resources make trawling systematically for evidence of individuals yield a richer haul of relevant documents and references today than in those when we had to rely on writing formal letters of inquiry to the custodians of local archives in request of information. Yet I could find nothing about Margaret Croft beyond the fact that she'd been a maid of honour to Elizabeth of Bohemia, wife of Frederick Elector Palatine, and sister of Charles I. Now, that's the only bit of connection that you need to keep in your minds, is that Elizabeth of Bohemia, to whom I will be referring regularly, known as the Winter Queen, in 1613 was married to Frederick Elector Palatine. Her father was James I of England, and her brother was Charles I of England. And although she never came back, and she was exiled on the mainland of Europe, this extraordinary connection that is not sufficiently really studied between the English and the Dutch via that bond, the brother and sister, major figures in the 2 countries, is what I'm really have at the back of my mind. Well, it's the back of all my work at the moment, I think. So, since I'd found that Margaret Croft was a maid of honour to Elizabeth of Bohemia, it was natural I should consult the acknowledged. This is a story about my own researches. It's a story I'm performing what we all do. And for those of you who are not archivists, you may be quite intrigued by the extent of informality, where what did I do? Lift the phone, called Nadine Ackerman, who is the acknowledged expert on Elizabeth of Bohemia. I hope she's here somewhere. Oh, there she is. Yes. Nadine Ackerman, who, as well as editing the 3 enormous volumes of Elizabeth's letters, is embarking on a much anticipated and much needed modern biography for Oxford University Press. So she pointed me in the direction of an obscure 1909 biography of the Queen of Bohemia, in which Margaret Croft's name does occur several times. The biography in question is by Mary Ann Everett Green, and its title was Elizabeth, Electress Palatine and Queen of Bohemia, and that 1909 very old-fashioned book was an expanded reissue of a brief biographical essay that Green had first published in 1855, so we're talking a 19th century source for Margaret Croft. Croft appears several times in Green's book, which, after the fashion of its age, has what feels for us like a slightly saccharine, sentimental tone to its conscientious excavation of the lives of prominent ladies from the historical archives. Croft attracts Green's attention both because of her amorous adventures at court and because she was deemed to be the author of a significant letter chronicling an important royal tour, a Dutch royal tour, which took place in the summer of 1625, this year I'm interested in. As far as I'm aware, this is the only eyewitness account of any triumphal tour taken by the new Dutch stadtholder and his also new wife, I'll come back to that in a minute, together with Elizabeth and Frederick of Bohemia, remember Charles I's sister and her husband. Green's selective quotations that Nadine had directed me to were tantalizingly vivid, but they're very selective and very short. I made a note at that point that I would follow up this one substantial piece of evidence directly involving Croft at a later date. There is no portrait of Margaret Croft, or Madge, as various other people refer to her in letters. I like Madge Croft a lot. She's also called Croft and Crofts indiscriminately, and I'll call her that indiscriminately. So we'll have to make do with this. I'm notorious for producing not portraits. This is not a portrait of Margaret Croft. This is, in fact, a detail from a sketch in a book of watercolour sketches of the northern Netherlands, made in the 1620s, which includes several from-life studies of Elizabeth of Bohemia and Amalia van Solms and their entourages. So this is not Margaret Croft, but it is at least someone very like her from Elizabeth of Bohemia's immediate court circle. And by now, I think it is Margaret Croft. That's what archivists do too. Here, however, and again, this is in the historian's mode, here is an actual physical glimpse. So, of course, we have this, which we love. Now, here is the actual Margaret Croft, a trace of her hand on paper, a note in the National Archives at Kew, where it is catalogued as possibly to Lord Conway, though I can't find any reason why that should be the case. I'll have to ask Nadine afterwards. The note reads, "I beseech your lordship to read this enclosed and let me know your pleasure. Your most humble and most obedient servant, Margaret Croft." And you can only see that down at the bottom there. As a start, I think this nicely conveys a possible role for Margaret as intermediary and facilitator. She passes a written communication to an English nobleman, the enclosed, and she offers her services to carry out the instructions it contains. And that's a very familiar thing for ladies of the court to do, gentlemen of the court too. So there's a substantial letter which is not there, which has disappeared, and then there's Margaret's volunteering to do whatever is being asked to be done in the letter. Margaret appears to have come to The Hague with the English ambassador Sir Dudley Carleton's wife in 1623, and to have joined the household of the exiled Queen of Bohemia, Charles I's sister, who was, of course, herself English by birth, a year later. She's associated, mostly by hearsay, with a number of sentimental scandals at the court of Elizabeth of Bohemia, of which more shortly. In 1637, she fell out with Princess Elizabeth, the Queen of Bohemia's eldest daughter, over a man, and was let go while on a visit to England. Queen Elizabeth of Bohemia lobbied her brother Charles and other prominent English court figures like Archbishop Laud by letter to have Margaret paid a significant sum as compensation for her 13 years' service. This, in fact, is the letter from which we can learn. This is from Lady Carleton. Oh, it's slopey. That was nearly a disaster for posterity. This is the letter. I only show it to you to show that we have documentary evidence, which does, in fact, talk about whether Elizabeth of Bohemia will take Margaret Croft into her household. You can all now practice reading it. And this is an easy one. And this is to Sir Dudley Carleton, to her husband. This is Lady Carleton to her husband. In her biography of Elizabeth of Bohemia, Green tells us that in November 1625, the Queen of Bohemia, an inveterate matchmaker, she's always trying to get people married off, made serious attempts to broker a marriage between Margaret Croft and the younger son of the Scottish Earl of Mar. Just so that you're, again, this is just bits of British history. The Earl of Mar is the most senior nobleman in the court of the Scottish king. He traditionally took charge of babies. Anne of Denmark was very upset about this. Any baby born to the Scottish king was put in charge of the family of the Earl of Mar, and then when they were 7, they were brought back and elected king. Hence, Scotland was an elective monarchy. But mothers didn't feel particularly happy about their boys being removed at birth. And every time, with Anne of Denmark, I was going to not digress tonight, but every time a baby died, they'd say, oh, we need another one. The baby's died. Can we have the next one? So Elizabeth of Bohemia, I'm suggesting somewhat naively, tried to broker a marriage between Margaret Croft and the younger son of the second son by his second marriage of the Scottish Earl of Mar. Elizabeth wrote to the Earl in a letter delivered by that very son, returning from what had evidently been an enjoyable sojourn at the Palatine Court in The Hague, as follows. I cannot let your worthy son return to you without these lines to continue the assurance of my affection. He will acquaint you with a business that nearly concerns him, which is an affection he has taken to a gentlewoman that serves me, whom he desires, with your consent, to make his wife. For the gentlewoman, Crofts, I can assure you she is an honest, discreet woman, and doth carry herself very well. If I had not this good opinion of her, I should not entreat you, as I do by these letters, that you will give him your consent to marry her. And this is Elizabeth of Bohemia around this time. Elizabeth of Bohemia becomes another matriarchal figure in history, and actually it's quite unusual an early portrait. There aren't many early portraits of her roughly as a young woman, of the sort of young woman who would write that sort of letter cheerily saying, would you possibly let my lady-in-waiting marry your extremely noble son? In spite of Elizabeth's assurance that Henry Erskine hath not made any acquainted with it because you should know it first, and that she herself, quote, came to the knowledge of the relationship by chance, for seeing him much with her, I did suspect it, and asking him the question, he confessed to me his love, this affair had surely come to the attention of the court in The Hague. We do not know what the Earl of Mar's response was, but we can be certain that a family as close to the Scottish and English thrones as the Mars would not have countenanced a marriage to a non-noble maid of honour, not even for a younger son by a second marriage. We may assume, therefore, that Margaret had been associated with Henry Erskine for some time at Elizabeth's court, and that their relationship was court gossip. When permission for the marriage was not forthcoming, her reputation suffered. Subsequently, her name is associated romantically with a number of prominent figures in Dutch court circles. Constantin Huygens, and here he is with his wife Susanna, another posthumous portrait because she died very young, and this is a portrait with her and him playing music together, but she's dead at the point at which this is painted. But I wanted him with a lady because we're going to talk about Constantin Huygens' behaviour to ladies. Constantin Huygens had probably made Margaret Croft's acquaintance when he took up his new post as secretary to Frederick Hendrick in April 1625. We're back at this critical moment. And moved, effectively, by getting the job of first secretary to the new stadtholder, the boss, the guy who was going to become royalty, effectively, he moved from the bourgeoisie into court circles in The Hague. In 2009-10, when you remember I started this work, what I was interested in was a decorous, semi-formal and chaste series of epistolary exchanges between Huygens and a young woman called Dorothee van Dorp, a neighbour in the elite Het Plein district of Den Haag, a childhood friend and reputedly Constantin Huygens' fiancée. And what I found remarkable about the fragmentary correspondence with Margaret Croft was how markedly different it was in tone and content from the Van Dorp correspondence. The first of his surviving notes to Croft is dated in Huygens' hand in the margin of the draft, 5th of August 1627, devant Groll. That is, during the annual summer military campaign against the French, on which Huygens accompanied the stadtholder. Its tone is flirtatious and conspiratorial, perhaps surprisingly considering that Constantine had been married to Susanna for little more than 4 months at the time. Huygens suggests that he's been encouraged to write because the Count of Hanau, by insinuation Margaret's lover or protector, has taken him, Constantine, into his confidence. Over the next several months, Huygens keeps Margaret Croft informed of the fact that intercepted letters from her threaten to make known some indiscretion and damage to her and others' reputations, and implies that only his own intervention will keep the matter from public knowledge. There's little doubt, well, it's actually fairly obvious, that he intends to suggest that there might be favours owed by Mademoiselle Croft towards himself for his services in interceding in this way. Such favours may indeed have been forthcoming. A letter in the same run, written to her much later in 1633, implies considerable familiarity, not only between Constantine and Madge, but also between Madge and Constantine's sister Constantia, and the letter closes in terms of intense affection. So here's one of the letters. Now, this is what we archivists do. We show you a letter that you could not possibly read to show how clever we are, right? I do have to tell you, it is practically illegible, isn't it, Nadine? And it is a problem. These letters are a problem, I have to confess. These letters are a problem because Constantin Huygens is bilingual in English and Dutch and speaks beautiful French. But he speaks beautiful English, but his French is actually not perfect. So not only is this is his rough draft, incidentally, so not only is it pretty well illegible, but it's also in sort of franglais, or whatever the franglais Dutch. Anyway, if anyone likes to read that letter while I'm talking, you know. Okay. The tone of the letters is teasing, and they are scandalous letters. That's, I think, why Vorp didn't transcribe them. It suggests that the court circles of the stadtholder, and this is my first point really, so we have all these lovely letters which people like me and lots of other Dutch scholars have studied, lovely letters between educated ladies and gentlemen in The Hague about engraving on glass and writing poetry and music and so on. And then there are these dirty letters, which have sat in the archive and nobody quite knows what to do with them, which is the drift of where I'm going. So what these letters suggest is that the court circles of the stadtholder and the King and Queen of Bohemia were worlds away from the decorous middle-class salons of Huygens and his literary friends like P.C. Hooft, whose exchanges of letters with educated, artistic Dutch women have been closely studied by historians like myself, and of course, and this is also becoming a part of the theme of this lecture, because they enable us to get a glimpse for once of learned women in this period interacting with men on a not facetious basis. And so that's why we've looked at those letters. So now I've come up with a crop of something else. This then was the context in which I encountered and became intrigued by Madge Croft. To be honest, although I wrote and published a paper which includes the correspondence to which I've just alluded, my paper on Dorothee van Dorp, in which I provide an appendix, I talk about these letters and I transcribe and translate them, Croft actually remained a puzzle to me, and I continued to worry that the scribbled notes I had transcribed didn't really contain enough of substance to allow me to understand the circumstances under which they were written, nor to do justice to the relationship, whatever that really was, between Margaret and Constantine. So now let's go back to that letter I was so anxious to find in the archives, the one Green had seen in the Public Record Office, as the TNA then was. If this was the BBC, I'd have to declare an interest because I'm a director of the TNA, right? And the director's here. I'm a non-executive director. He's the king, you know. So now let's go back to that letter I was so anxious to find in the archives, the one Green had seen in the Public Record Office. Green's scrupulously archivally based biography of Elizabeth of Bohemia quotes selectively from a letter in French written by Margaret Croft in June 1625 and intercepted on its way to Margaret's cousin in England. The letter is an eyewitness account chronicling events on a very jolly celebratory tour of North Holland taken by the calling them Royal Ladies of the Courts of the Hague, Elizabeth of Bohemia, Amalia van Solms and their entourages. It apparently circulated widely that autumn under the title, that is, the intercepted letter transcribed, circulated widely that autumn under the title Copie d'une lettre interceptée et déchiffrée, decoded, although I somewhat doubt that. Maybe it's just the handwriting again. En passant entre une des dames d'honneur de la reine de Bohême et une demoiselle, sa cousine, en Angleterre. We can safely attribute the letter to Margaret Croft. Sir George Goring wrote to the English ambassador, Sir Dudley Carleton, in September 1625 that a response to this letter, which he describes in exactly the terms of that title, is being written, possibly ghosted by himself, for which his intimate friend, he says, Madge Crofts, need only wait a week. I quote, but more of this in the answer to the Queen of Bohemia's demoiselle that wrote the voyage of North Holland, for which I beseech your lordship, believe her cousin here, shall not be unthankful. I pray you, my lord, command my gossip and fellow Madge Croft to forgive me but till next week. Spring 1625 was a momentous moment in the English and Dutch courts. On the 27th of March, early April by continental calculations, the English king, James I, had died, to be succeeded by his son, Charles I, Elizabeth of Bohemia's devoted brother, and a strong supporter of the Protestant Palatine cause for which her father had systematically refused to give political or military support. This in spite of his daughter Elizabeth's passionate epistolary entreaties for him to help restore her and her husband to their former territories, seized by the Catholic Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand in 1620. And Nadine is working on those letters at the moment. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of pleading letters to Elizabeth's father in the 1620s. In the Netherlands, in April 1625, Stadtholder Moritz had died without an heir on the 23rd of April. He had plenty of offspring, but he'd never married, so he didn't have an heir. On his deathbed, Moritz had insisted that his half-brother, Frederick Hendrick, so these are all children of the man called William the Silent, whom I'm also quite interested in. With his half-brother, Frederick Hendrick, Moritz had insisted on his deathbed that he marry his current mistress, Amalia von Solms, chief maid of honour to Elizabeth of Bohemia, so as to ensure the continuity of the Nassau line, so it wouldn't happen again. Because on his deathbed, he made, literally, they had the ceremony over the deathbed, Amalia and Frederick Hendrick got married. That's Amalia, his current squeeze at that moment. That summer, Amalia van Solms, the new stadtholder's new wife, together with Elizabeth of Bohemia, her very recently former employer, toured North Holland in triumph to celebrate, effectively, amongst other things, Amalia's meteoric rise from one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting to Princess of Orange, and to celebrate the fact that Elizabeth's brother Charles was now King of England, giving the Bohemian exiles much more status and, they hoped, significant influence in the Protestant political league in mainland Europe. We're at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, for anybody in this audience. I almost want to make you put your hands up if you know about the 30 Years' War. It's the beginning of the 30 Years' War. It was a joyous trip, this trip, which we only know from Madge Croft's letter, full of expectation and excitement, and to judge from the brief extracts quoted by Green, its jubilant atmosphere was vividly captured in that intercepted letter. It has to be said, though, that in her biography of Elizabeth of Bohemia, Green sounds just a little bit reluctant about having to rely on this particular document. She writes, "As the record of Elizabeth and Bohemia and Amalia von Solmes's excursion, though minute, was written by a young lady of the court whose only thought was amusement, we must be content with such details as are afforded in her sprightly narrative, from which all serious subjects are banished." So, it's a pity, reading between the lines, we can hear Everett Green saying, that this eyewitness account of an important, otherwise unrecorded journey is written in such a frivolous fashion, thereby detracting from the fundamental importance of the occasion. The frivolity is to be contrasted with, say, the published accounts of the lavish occasions along the route of the journey Elizabeth of Bohemia made in 1613 for her marriage to Frederick. And I won't read you any of this, but this is a whole booklet that was published in 1613 about Elizabeth's first trip across the Netherlands when she came to marry. She crossed the northern Low Countries in order to go to Heidelberg to marry the Elector Palatine. And it, in this text, if you get bored while it's on the screen, you can read, gives wonderful accounts of fireworks and formal dinners and dancing and hunting and shooting that went on day after day as they, much as would happen with William and Kate now. They're the excursions in 1613. So I set off to decide about the contents of the letter myself. I felt I had to go and read the letter. In late 2010, with Green's, so now I'm in 2010, you've got two sets of dates, you've got 1625 and you've got all of that going, and now you've got me, right? So in late 2010, with Green's State Papers Holland reference number in the now TNA, Sell's trusty archival sleuth Dr. Robin Adams and I went in search of Margaret Croft's letter. We spent a long, frustratingly fruitless day there, ably assisted by the TNA's ever-helpful staff. We failed to find any trace of the letter. Yet all of us were convinced that the letter must be there somewhere. That's we and the staff of the TNA. All of us were confident that Green must have seen the document, and we were equally confident that a document once in the TNA will never have been destroyed. It will simply have been misplaced. I began to suspect it had been misplaced deliberately. Green had clearly been disconcerted by the contents of the letter and its sprightly tone, unseemly perhaps, coming from a lady of Elizabeth's court. Perhaps she had cannily lodged it out of place in the archive, where it was safe, but where the curious could only find it again with difficulty. That's another thing we do. We hide things in the archive. We put them one shelf away from where they belong, and nobody knows they're there but us, right? I know it was only the work of one single day at TNA. I'm pretty embarrassed about that because many of you, I'm looking at Peter Hennessy there, many of you comb the archives for weeks and months looking for pieces of archival evidence. But you know, I do too many things, I'm too busy. A whole day I spent there, right? Morning, opening hour to closing hour and no time for lunch. And as far as I was concerned, that was a very, very intensive search, right? So I'm afraid at this point I gave up and turned to other things. Then in August of this year, which was oh so timely for my new life, Nadine emailed me to say that she had accidentally come across a published, if you can believe it, printed transcription of the Croft letter, quite by chance, in an appendix to Martin Royalton Kish's 1988 facsimile edition of Adrian van der Venne's watercolour picture album from the 1620s. So, the album from which I took that picture of not Margaret Croft. Here's another lovely one, right? This is Elizabeth and Frederick, Elizabeth of Bohemia and Frederick Elector Palatine out of that same watercolour book. Now, it's a beautiful facsimile published in 1988, and I don't know how she came to be reading the appendix behind the footnotes at the end of it, but Nadine had spotted that that Martin Royalton Kish had transcribed this letter. Why? Because these pictures are all very informal, and they don't quite look like royalty. They look a bit more like they might be having fun. Particularly, I have another couple that I'll be showing you. And so he had put it in French. It's not translated, had transcribed it. And he just has a little header to it which says, oh, I've put this in because this shows you that they were quite informal on lots of occasions. So Royalton Kitch made nothing of the letter. He didn't translate it, but he did give the correct State Papers reference, one whole volume away from where we had been looking. It was instead of being in State Papers Holland, where it belonged, Margaret Croft's letter was in State Papers German. Within days, this is where it gets exciting, within days Nadine had retrieved scans of the letters and emailed them to me, the joys of the State Papers online, and I had translated it. You can imagine our excitement. Were we finally going to be able to unravel the mystery of the strikingly active, manipulative role Margaret Croft played in the lives of several influential men at the courts of England and the Netherlands? Would the letter explain the innuendo in Constantin Huygens' note to Margaret Croft? Would we find out if he was cheating on his wife, Susanna? So here is the first sheet of that letter. So you can see it's not the original letter. It's the copy. It's the intercepted copy. Beautiful handwriting, easy to read, and interestingly inscribed as having at least this copy gone to Francis Nethersole, and it's being circulated amongst the court in London, the gentlemen of the court. So would it answer all those questions? The answer turned out to be a resounding no. So I could stop the lecture there. But before I explain further, I need to pause here to explain why I was so confident that the informant on Margaret Croft, to whom Nadine Ackerman had originally directed my attention, Mary Ann Everett Green, was to be taken extremely seriously, why I trusted her reference. Now we're in another century. We're in the 19th century now. You see, Green is a figure of iconic status for anyone who works on the State Papers Domestic in the TNA for the early modern period. She was one of a band of Victorian women historians who worked, thanklessly and assiduously in the archives, retrieving the buried traces of women's writing from under the mountains of correspondence exchanged through official and unofficial channels by prominent men. By the way, for those of you who are not historians, the State Papers Domestic are just all the government papers, exactly as now, all the government papers for a particular period, all bundled together. And what Mary Ann Everett Green and her colleagues were doing in this period in the 19th century was sorting them, indexing them, and itemizing them so that people could actually use them, so they ceased to be mere bundles. Green's reputation for accuracy was legendary. It can be tracked through all the adulatory reviews of the published volumes of the Calendars of State Papers Domestic as they issued in the late 19th century. When I had suggested that Green might have deliberately misplaced the Croft letter among the State Papers, I was encouraged in this surmise by the early modern record specialist at the TNA, Dr. Katie Mayer, who's a Cell graduate, who told me that in all her time as the archivist in charge of this period at the National Archives, in all her time checking Green's calendars against the original State Papers, she had never found her to have made a mistake in her cataloguing. In 1854, remarkably, Green was the very first government-appointed editor of the state papers housed in the Public Record Office in London. At the time of her appointment, she was the author of the highly acclaimed and recently published Lives of the Princesses of England in 6 volumes, in which she demonstrated her command of archival materials and her mastery of archival skills, including paleography, ancient and modern languages, and a formidable determination to do justice to every single fragment of surviving epistolary evidence. And as I say, she was particularly wanting to do this for the fragments of epistolary fragments for women, because they tended to get neglected by her male archival colleagues. It still seems extraordinary today that such a prominent position should have been given to a relatively young woman. She was in her early 30s, and indeed no other woman held an equivalent position in the PRO until the 20th century. And now I just quickly quote a little bit about her there's one absolutely wonderful biographical article by Christine L. Kruger about Mary Ann Everett Green. Over the next 40 years from her time of her appointment, Green became the most prolific and among the most highly respected of the editors involved in this monumental government project. When she was approached for the calendar's editorship, Green was editing the diary of John Rouse, which she eventually published in 1856. She accepted the appointment and began working in 1855 in the State Paper Office. Despite giving birth to a daughter in November 1856, and despite only being assisted in her calendaring work by her sister Esther when other editors had paid staff assistants, Green proved to be the most efficient compiler of calendars. And in 1857, the first volume of Calendar of State Papers Domestic, James I, appeared, with its editor identified as Mary Ann Everett Green, author of the Lives of the Princesses of England. Although because I always saw her name as M.A.E. Green, it was an incredibly long time before I realized that she was a woman. She continued at the pace of more than a calendar volume a year for the next 38 years. She edited 41 volumes in total while bringing up 4 children. Green became a fixture at the Public Record Office, remembered for her indefatigable work habits, as well as for feeding the pigeons every morning on the steps of the officers' chambers. And this is Mary Ann Everett Green. So now I hope you can see why I was so taken with Green's reference to Margaret Croft's letter. First of all, I knew it must be important, and secondly, I trusted her reference. It had been turned up by the most eminent of State Papers archivists, who had judged it to be of interest, though with some reservations, and then who appeared to have misplaced it. The letter Nadine and I found, frankly, failed to live up to its promise, or rather, our expectations. This is another of these lovely watercolours. This is them, it's billiards they're playing here. I think it's supposed to be one of the first pictures of billiards being played. And I forget which is which, but one of them is Amalia van Solms and the other is Elizabeth of Bohemia. Now, to explain why the letter was such a disappointment to us, I have to read you some of the letter, and I'm going to read it, therefore, to you, not in its entirety, although it's not very long. Here is what our voyage of exploration through the archives in Britain and the Netherlands had eventually uncovered in my translation from the French. Mademoiselle, my most dear cousin, I wanted to send you a true account of all the remarkable things that have happened on the tour that the King and Queen, accompanied by the Princess of Orange, have made very recently to North Holland, and I'll do it in the form of a journal, beginning thus. Thursday, the 26th of June, we left The Hague towards Haarlem in coaches, dressed in our customary travel outfits with hats rather than bonnets, which caused great misunderstanding among the good people who saw us past, who thought that the Queen and the Princess were the minor royals, William and Ludovic, and the rest of us were their pages, as also happened to a good woman from Haarlem who came in to see the Queen but left the room dissatisfied, saying she'd seen 3 young men at the table with no women in their company. We were fortunate enough to find ourselves in Haarlem at the time of the Kermesse Carnival, which gave us the opportunity to send a big package of presents back to The Hague, which arrived opportunely the following day when Baron Cromwell was entertaining the English ambassador and all those of rank from that county at the court of Holland, so that there was a gift for everyone, especially Monsieur Saint-Léger, who, being interested in paintings, received one especially sent to him by the Queen. The subject of the painting was a mother furious with her child, beating him so hard with her hand on his buttocks that his sauce flowed out copiously. All represented, I leave it to your imagination, all represented in so lively a fashion that the judgment of the spectators was not adequate to know the author. But Monsieur Saint-Léger, who has a better nose than others in similar matters, recognised that it was by the hand of Jan Gossart. Couldn't possibly, that's a joke, right? Jan Gossart does largely religious paintings. And this was obviously quite a rude painting. I think I slightly modern. My husband kept saying to me this morning, you can't use some of those words in an inaugural, but I will. Passing through Petten, which is the name of a place, P-E-T-T-E-N, it gets a little bit complicated. Passing through Petten, we ate too many mussels, and we were served wine which tasted like vinegar. So the Countess of Lowenstein was taken with a terrible colic. But as every illness has its remedy, so farting was taken, farting in French is péter, P-E-T-T-E-R. So péter cured Petten, the Petten illness. Between which place and Enkhuizen, we went through Medemblik, which town being situated at the extreme end of this country. Young Master William, that's one of those young royals, who met us there accidentally, having just undertaken a new commission, jumped suddenly out of the Queen's carriage and, throwing himself headlong down on the ground to show his humility, kissed the backside of North Holland. A big fat peasant who acted that day as our guide taught the company a new refinement by blowing his nose between his fingers, which he wiped by and by on his beard. And having been invited to eat with us as a reward for his good manners, he didn't refuse to sit at the top end of the table, nor to be the first to put the hand he'd wiped on his beard into every dish, most especially into a particularly tasty benefice pie, which we thought we had reserved for ourselves. The multilingual jokes now get even sharper. I mean, it's obviously written by someone very intelligent because it's full of all these clever puns and games on words. The multilingual jokes get sharper. The cabinet of Dr. Paludanus is the greatest curiosity in Enkhuizen, where, among other things worthy of admiration, we saw a certain large and thick and stiff instrument, concerning which... You're getting ahead of me there. Concerning which the Countess of Lowenstein, who understood more than the rest of us about the secrets of nature, desiring to be informed about it, asked the doctor this amiable question. Monsieur Doctor, if you please, what is this engine? Questo è, replied the doctor, who was entertaining us in Italian, il valente cazzo d'un elefante. This is the lusty penis of an elephant. I do not understand Italian, replied the Countess. Hoc est membrum genitale elephantis, said the doctor, resorting to Latin. This is the genital member of an elephant. Why, say it in good French what it is, replied the Countess. The doctor, finding himself thus hard-pressed, said, this is an elephant's prick with which to do you very good service. But it made you laugh too. I thought they were so puerile that it was... By the end of the journey and the letter, the sexual innuendo comes thick and fast. Arriving in Amsterdam on the evening of the 1st of July, we found Ambassador Carleton with Colonel Morgan awaiting our arrival. We were magnificently received there and paid for, as throughout North Holland, by the local magistrates, and entertained with diverse spectacles, of which the most notable were the two houses of the East and West Indies. In the first, we found a banquet of nutmegs, cloves, ginger, and other fruits of the East, which encouraged us to go with great zeal to the second, hoping to fill our pockets with gold and silver as the fruits of the West Indies. But that had to wait, apparently, for the return of the First Fleet. In the great scales of the East Indies house, the princess, that's Amalia, being weighed against the Queen, Elizabeth, in the big scales, was found to have lost several pounds in weight in the time since they had been in the same place. And on inquiring the reason why from the sheriff, it's because, he said, during that time, you've lost your virginity, which is generally a very heavy burden for young women. In the evening, thinking to say goodbye to the magistrates with the intention of leaving at dawn the following morning for The Hague, the old servant of the Queen, who had fallen in love with Amalia, kissed and tickled her with so much affection, playing with his fingers on her buttocks, that the Queen began to be jealous, principally on seeing that the princess, on the warm insistence of her lover, had agreed to stay one more day in Amsterdam. Right. For some reason, I put in This is the best I can do for you with the Countess of Lowenstein, who I'm going to come back to. This is a letter. Actually, I think it does, like that little note of anybody, anyway, who has ever looked at handwriting. The Countess of Lowenstein, who's the one who is the butt of all those crude jokes and mostly gets her bottom pinched and her buttocks fondled, and it's all very explicit. I haven't, in fact, I have damped it down. She writes in this incredibly bold hand. Her spelling is atrocious. She's English and she's writing, she's in fact Elizabeth Dudley, Countess of Lowenstein. Okay, so that's a letter, her letter. So you see, the court circles of the Dutch stadtholder and the Queen of Bohemia really were as full of saucy behaviour and intrigue as that correspondence, at least to judge from this letter, as that correspondence I came across between Sir Constantin Huygens and Margaret Croft. But unfortunately, that does not seem to add much. This is where I'm coming to my problem, all of you who study documents here. That doesn't seem to add very much. What am I going to do with it? That doesn't seem to add much to our understanding of these powerful circles, led by formidable, ambitious 17th century women. In fact, Nadine and I sort of discussed whether you would do a sort of critical edition. Can you imagine doing a critical edition with variants and footnotes of that letter? I don't think so. Someone would publish it, but I don't. Indeed, it's the indecorousness of that letter that actually makes us scholars uneasy, and I think particularly women scholars, because it seems to uncut the stories that we've recently begun to tell about how significant as major players on the political stage figures like Elizabeth of Bohemia actually were. And I really recommend to you the correspondence of Elizabeth of Bohemia. Elizabeth of Bohemia used to behave as a silly lady who had a pet monkey and lots of dogs and liked dancing. And now we will have, by the time Nadine's finished, 2,000 or more letters, most of which are political documents negotiating, crossing Europe. Absolutely extraordinary correspondence. Quite a different figure. But now I'm back with saucy letters, so now I'm undercutting Nadine's work. What am I going to do about that? What are we to do with Croft's letter? I could stop there too, but I'm just going to have a coda, and it's quite quick. I cannot, of course, really end this lecture by throwing my hands up in the air and, after all the effort and anticipation, discarding that intercepted letter. Although when I began writing this letter, I thought that's what I was going to tell you I had to do. I intended to make it part of a cautionary tale to remind us that not everything we scholars undertake in good faith will turn out to yield fruit. And I have to risk one more digression, which is my mentor, the wonderful French historian Nathalie Zeman-Davis, now in her 80s, who is my absolute role model, once stayed with me on her way back from the Vatican archive, where she'd been working for 3 months trying to find a trace of the Ottoman slave who became a figure at the court of Leo X. Leo Africanus, and about whom she wrote a whole book. And she sat at our breakfast table and she said, in her lovely measured way, "I've worked for 3 months in the Vatican. It's terribly exciting, Lisa. I found not a single trace of Leo Africanus, and that's really important." I thought I'd slip my wrists if I did that. Yet after all the effort spent on locating this particular document, transcribing it, translating it in its entertaining detail, tracking down its references, surely it can contribute in some way to my continuing scholarly endeavours. So what avenues of research might it open up for us? 2 figures stand out from the letter itself. They are the 2 ladies about whom the scurrilous jokes involving thighs and buttocks are made, Amalia von Solms and the Countess of Lowenstein, who, as I say, is an Englishwoman, Elizabeth Dudley. At the beginning of 1625, both were maids of honour to Queen Elizabeth of Bohemia. Shortly before the letter was written, Amalia married Frederick Hendrick, the new Dutch stadtholder, really by accident. Frederick Hendrick was a terrible womanizer. Amalia did literally happen to be his latest squeeze. His brother was dying. He said, marry her. She got it. It was like musical chairs. She was sitting on the chair when the music stopped. The Countess of Lowenstein replaced Amalia as the leading female member of Elizabeth's household, and she remained in that position until Elizabeth of Bohemia's death after a long and varied life in 1662 in London. Elizabeth liked to refer to her as my merry widow. She had in fact been briefly married. As far as Margaret Croft's letter is concerned, no rules of propriety or decorum separate the way that Margaret talks about the behaviour of and towards Amalia and the Countess of Lowenstein. Amalia is simply the maid of honour jumped up into the stadtholder's wife. Yet by the time her husband died in 1647, Amalia had transformed herself into a formidable dowager widow. That woman, think of that, all those buttocks and jokes, and it's this woman in the middle here of this great portrait. And her court into one of the European royal centres of opulence and ceremonial, which suggests to me that an in-depth study of Amalia post-1624-5 would have a great deal to tell us about the extraordinary process of self-conscious elevation which took place in the international reputation of the House of Orange under her astute management. So any grad student looking for a postdoc topic, there's a good one. Personally, though, I really want to know more about that deliciously saucy, intelligent and witty Countess of Lowenstein. When Elizabeth of Bohemia died in London, the Countess arranged, after the restoration of Charles II, so in 1662, it was the Countess of Lowenstein who arranged for the Queen's apartments to be sealed up for probate, and she took possession of very significant quantities of goods and gems in settlement for major sums of money that she, Elizabeth of Lowenstein, had loaned the Queen of Bohemia during the last years of her life, so that she'd risen obviously to some position of some eminence. But another figure has presided in ghostly form over my lecture, and it's with that woman that I'm going to end, Mary Ann Everett Green, whose tireless efforts, cataloguing 41 volumes of State Papers Domestic in the second half of the 19th century, made all historians' research in this period possible. She made all of our research possible. Scholars like myself are bound to acknowledge, sooner or later, that Green is the puppet mistress who pulls the strings on our excursions into the state papers. It is her calendars which inevitably guide our searches, and her omissions and elisions, not to mention the compelling running narrative with which she animates the record, which determine where we venture and where we pass by. So since I earlier accused Green of hiding my saucy Margaret Croft letter in the National Archives, let me end with a final telling story which perhaps supports my surmise. I should say that I owe this fitting close to my lecture to fellow academic Professor Norma Clark, who I hope is here. Yay! Who raised it during the question period at an earlier dry-run version of this lecture, which I presented to the CEL graduate students at their highly successful conference here at UCL in November. During her long professional life, Green moved within a circle of distinguished Victorian men and women of letters. She was one of only 3 women to sign a public petition in 1851 asking the Public Record Office to give free access to its records for serious scholars, a request which was granted in 1852, which again makes all of our research possible. Other signatories included Charles Dickens, Thomas Babington Macaulay, and Thomas Carlyle. One of those to whom Green became particularly close was the influential novelist, writer, and reviewer Geraldine Dewsbury, a name to conjure with in her own day, but now mostly remembered only for her passionate friendship, extending over a period of more than 20 years, with Thomas Carlyle's wife, Jane Welsh Carlyle. In 1880, when she'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and was in her final illness, Geraldine Dewsbury turned to her friend, the State Papers archivist, Mary Ann Everett Green, for help in putting in order the voluminous body of papers and correspondence she'd accumulated during her long and active literary life. Prominent among the items she had treasured over the years was a large bundle of intimate letters sent to her by Jane Carlyle over those 20-odd years of their friendship. Here's Jane Welsh Carlyle. Jane Carlyle had died unexpectedly and suddenly in 1866, very much earlier, leaving her own papers in disorder. When Thomas Carlyle started to put them to rights, he discovered, to his distress, that his wife had been deeply unhappy in their relationship and had confided her unhappiness with details of what she considered to be serious unkindness on his part to many of her literary friends. Stricken with guilt, in 1871, so still some considerable time before Geraldine Dewsbury's death, in 1871, Thomas Carlyle passed all of his wife's letters to his younger historian colleague and protege, J.A. Froude, with instructions to publish them as he saw fit after his, Thomas Carlyle's, death. Froude began publishing them with commentary 2 years after Carlyle's death, and the story of the subsequent public scandal is well known to historians of that period. Thomas Carlyle's reputation never recovered. Stories of domestic abuse, of unkindness, the possibility he might never have had sex with her. It's a scandal that builds up, and Froude is also caught up in it because it's considered unseemly that he should have published this, and yet he felt he was doing it because Thomas Carlyle had asked him to. This is Geraldine Dewsbury. During his work on the Jane Welsh Carlyle papers, and remember, Froude had the time between 1871 and Geraldine's death, Froude naturally consulted Geraldine Dewsbury regularly because she had been so close to Jane Carlyle. Geraldine provided him with a good deal of detail about her friend's life, and you can find that in the published volumes of the letters. Geraldine's letters to Jane, of course, were among Jane's papers. They survived. They were there. They were in the house, in Jane's house, and in fact, they were eventually published separately. Jane Carlyle and Geraldine Dewsbury's long-running relationship had been an intense, sometimes very tempestuous, always passionate one. Early in their correspondence, Geraldine had written to Jane Carlyle, "Oh, my dear, if you and I are drowned or die, what would become of us if any superior person were to go and write our life and errors? What a precious mess a truthful person would go and make of us, and how very different to that we really are or were." Shortly before Geraldine Dewsbury's death, on Mary Ann Everett Green's advice, she burned the entire bundle of intimate letters from Jane Carlyle. It was for Green, the archival scholar, a matter of propriety, which transcended any responsibilities towards important documents she might feel she had as an archival historian. The very same woman who had presided over the painstaking retrieval of the voices of women in the archives for the historical period stood equally vigilant and ready to defend their reputations from the disapproval of posterity. There was a propriety to be observed. In the interests of that decorum, even the most scrupulous of archivists might be persuaded to tamper with the evidence.
Well, I don't know where to begin. I mean, the applause says everything, so I'll just say a few things. I think we've been given an extraordinary demonstration of what Lisa Jardine does and who she is. That lecture was archival, feminist, subversive, rude. We are so glad, Lisa, that we would have been so disappointed if you hadn't been a little bit rude, deliciously saucy, to use just a couple of your own expressions. One of the moments in the lecture I love, which I felt in fact propelled it all the way through, was when you talked about the essential uncertainty of archival research as that which gives purpose to what you do. I don't think there are many people who could articulate with such clarity the fundamental ambivalence of that commitment, the uncertainty which gives purpose to the research that we do. I also felt that this lecture was a wonderful tribute to the feminist scholarship, which Lisa is also so profoundly associated with. I lost track of the number of heroines: Margaret Croft, Elizabeth of Bohemia, Jane Carlyle and Geraldine Dukesbury towards the end, Nadine Ackerman, but I think probably the most important of all was Mary Ann Everett Green, when you described her as having produced 38, but then it changed to 41 volumes and had 4 children. I did start to feel that in a way you were indirectly describing yourself. Although I think I've got the number of children slightly wrong. Okay, so as I say, you've given us the most extraordinary demonstration of who you are and why we appreciate and love you so much. Thank you, Lisa Jardine, and many congratulations at your new appointment. Thank you.